Picture it in fast cuts. A flash of camera bulbs on a red carpet, Johnny Depp smiling like a man who can't lose. Then a hard cut to charcoal courtroom sketches, faces frozen in disbelief, every gesture dissected like evidence. Then another cut, an empty soundstage, lights off a chair with no name on it, a silence that feels louder than applause. And then almost impossibly one more cut, a standing ovation, a room rising to its feet as if the world is trying to rewrite the ending in real time. Because Johnny Depp didn't just lose roles, he lost his name. For years, his name meant box office magic. It meant characters that felt like myths you could touch: pirates, misfits, dreamers, monsters with gentle eyes. He wasn't a typical leading man. He was a mask maker, an actor who could disappear so completely that audiences forgot there was a person underneath. Hollywood loves that kind of alchemy. Right up until the moment it becomes too expensive, too unpredictable, too dangerous to ensure. And then it happened. Not one scandal, not one headline, not one bad decision you can point to and say, that's the moment. This wasn't one scandal, it was a chain reaction. A private relationship turned public. Allegations became front-page verdicts before the courts ever spoke. The internet split into tribes. Studios did what studios always do: when risk spikes, they backed away quietly, efficiently, without ceremony. One day you're the face of a franchise, the next you're a liability no one wants to hold. But here's where the story gets stranger. Because the comeback didn't begin with forgiveness, it began with math. Not the math of feelings, of proof, of headlines, of contracts, of brand calculations, of who can still sell tickets without setting the whole machine on fire. And that's the question hanging over this entire saga: was this the downfall of a man collapsing under his own chaos, or a man erased by a culture that turns conflict into spectacle? By the end, you'll see why two things can be true at once, and why that's what made this story explode. Johnny Depp didn't climb the ladder of Hollywood the way most stars do. He didn't arrive polished, predictable, or safe. He arrived like a rumor, half music, half rebellion, the kind of face casting directors couldn't quite label. In an era when leading men were built like statues and scripted like slogans, Depp's power was that he looked like he might walk out of the scene at any moment. He carried anti-heartthrob energy, the boy who refuses the crown, the actor who seems allergic to being owned by an image. And that's exactly why audiences trusted him. Because Depp didn't act like he wanted to be admired. He acted like he wanted to disappear. He chose characters that leaned into the strange, the wounded, the misfit, a scissor-handed outsider, a haunted dreamer, a man who doesn't speak much but still somehow says everything. The industry kept trying to sell him as a conventional star, but what people actually bought was the opposite: his refusal to fit cleanly into the frame. He wasn't selling perfection, he was selling escape. Escape from the boring symmetry of good guys. Escape from the idea that you have to be normal to be loved. When Depp showed up on screen, he made weirdness look like freedom. He made vulnerability look like strength. And without ever giving a speech, he taught a certain kind of viewer something dangerous: you can be broken, eccentric, even misunderstood, and still be magnetic. But the thing about building your myth on being an outsider is this: it's powerful when you're winning and weaponized when you're not. Because an outsider aura is flexible. Fans read it as authenticity. Studios read it as risk. The public can flip it overnight, from mysterious to unstable, from unconventional to unreliable, from artistic to problem. And once that label sticks, every rumor starts to sound like proof, every headline feels inevitable, and the story begins to write itself without you. But the same outsider aura that made him famous would later make him easy to frame. Then came Pirates, and with it the kind of lightning that rewires a career so completely it stops being a career at all. One performance turned Johnny Depp from the outsider you root for into something Hollywood rarely creates on purpose: a global symbol. Jack Sparrow wasn't just a character. He was a walking logo, a costume you could recognize from a silhouette, a voice people could imitate with 2 words and a wobble. Overnight, he became meme power before memes were even the language of the world. Kids copied him, adults quoted him, brands circled him. Studios built release calendars around him like orbiting planets. And that's when the industry's relationship with Depp quietly changed. Because when you're just an actor, your job is to be talented. But when you become a franchise, your job is to be stable. Suddenly, it wasn't only about performance, it was about schedules, insurance policies, investors, overseas markets, and the terrifying question every studio executive asks when a film costs hundreds of millions: Can we count on you? The weirdness audiences loved became something accountants had to price. The spontaneity that made Sparrow feel alive became a variable that could delay a set, inflate a budget, and shake a boardroom. When your face becomes a franchise, the real you becomes a liability. Because the moment a studio depends on you to protect a billion-dollar brand, your humanity turns into risk. Every rumor becomes a red flag. Every off day becomes a report. Every personal struggle becomes a spreadsheet. And the mask that once gave you freedom starts to harden into a requirement. Deliver the same magic again and again and again, no matter what is happening inside your life. That's the trap of iconic success. The world doesn't just want you to be great. It wants you to be repeatable. It wants the character on demand, the chaos controlled, the art turned into a product that never breaks. And then the machine demanded more, faster, bigger, more sequels, more pressure, more money at stake, more eyes watching for cracks. And in stories like this, the cracks don't appear all at once. They appear slowly until one day the entire myth shatters in public. After Pirates, the checks got bigger, and so did the silence around what those checks actually meant. Because when you're paid like a miracle, you're expected to behave like one. Every film set becomes a moving city. Every delay becomes a headline-sized number, and every decision you make stops being personal. It becomes logistical, contractual, reportable. At that level, fame isn't just attention, it's infrastructure, and that's where the slow leak begins. Not with a single explosion, but with small signals that start to cluster, a whisper here, a tense quote there, a story about difficult behavior that spreads faster than context ever can. The thing about Hollywood is that it doesn't need certainty to react. It only needs the possibility of trouble. A rumor doesn't have to be proven to become expensive. It just has to make someone in a boardroom imagine risk. Bigger money creates bigger expectations. Bigger expectations create tighter control. And tighter control makes any kind of chaos, real or exaggerated, feel like a threat. The public might think studios fear scandal. They don't. Scandal can be marketed, spun, even weaponized for attention. What studios fear is the thing they can't edit out: unpredictability. The day a production schedule becomes unstable is the day investors start sweating. The day an insurance company starts asking questions is the day a star stops being art and starts being exposure. In Hollywood, reputation is a credit score. It takes years to build and seconds to downgrade. One late arrival can be forgiven. A pattern becomes a label, and once a label exists, unreliable, volatile, hard to manage, it turns into a self-fulfilling prophecy because every new story gets interpreted through the same lens. Even neutral moments start sounding suspicious. Even creativity starts getting described as chaos. Meanwhile, the myth keeps demanding maintenance. The public still wants the genius. The studios still want the brand. The media still wants the angle. And the person underneath it all is trapped in a strange bargain. Keep performing the idea of yourself, even as the real life behind the curtain gets messier, louder, and harder to protect. And then, the private life became the public battlefield. Because once a celebrity's personal world turns into content, the story stops belonging to the people who lived it. It belongs to headlines, timelines, and crowds, millions of strangers deciding who you are before the truth even gets a chance to breathe. And this is where the story stops being about movies and becomes about mirrors. Because once the relationship conflict hit the headlines, it didn't land like a private tragedy. It landed like a public referendum. Overnight, people weren't just following news. They were choosing an identity. Fans and critics formed teams the way they form fandoms: fast, emotional, and certain. Every clip became a weapon. Every quote became a banner. And the human messiness that normally lives in the shadows of a relationship was dragged into daylight and turned into content. Social media doesn't handle nuance well. It rewards simplicity. It rewards outrage. It rewards the most confident voice in the room, even when that voice knows the least. A complicated story becomes a highlight reel. A painful argument becomes a meme. Context gets cropped. Tone gets rewritten. And suddenly millions of strangers feel like they have enough information to deliver verdicts. Not in a courtroom, but in comment sections and group chats. People weren't watching evidence, they were watching their beliefs. They saw what they needed to see. Some saw a symbol of a system finally holding powerful men accountable. Others saw a man being publicly erased before he could defend himself. And once those beliefs lock in, new information doesn't arrive as facts. It arrives as ammunition. The internet doesn't ask what's true. It asks, which side are you? Because picking a side feels like morality. It feels like protection. It feels like being the good guy. But it also turns real people into avatars and real pain into entertainment. And when that happens, the loudest version of the story becomes the truth, even if it's only the most shareable one. That's how conflict becomes identity warfare, not because the story is simple, but because the platform demands it. And once the world is split into teams, everything that follows becomes combustible, every rumor, every legal filing, every career decision. Then the courtroom era arrives, 2 systems, 2 outcomes, and a culture ready to explode. Now the story enters the one place where feelings don't automatically count as facts, the courtroom. And this is where it gets confusing for most people because trials don't answer the question the internet keeps screaming. A court isn't designed to declare who is good or evil. It's designed to answer a specific legal question under a specific legal standard with specific rules about what evidence is allowed, who has the burden of proof, and what defamation or libel actually means. Defamation and libel cases are not the same as criminal trials. They're not about sending someone to prison. They're about whether a statement damaged a person's reputation unlawfully and whether the evidence meets the threshold required by that court. The burden of proof matters. The wording of the claim matters. The jurisdiction matters. And that's why 2 cases that feel like the same story can produce outcomes that look contradictory from the outside. Same story, different legal questions, different results. Different countries operate under different legal frameworks. Different courts may weigh evidence differently based on their rules. Different claims focus on different statements. Even the difference between a judge deciding and a jury deciding can shape how a verdict lands. So when people ask, how can this happen? The real answer is because law isn't a single universal machine. It's a system of narrowly defined questions answered one at a time. But here's the pivot most people miss: the biggest verdict wasn't legal. It was cultural, because while one side watched for legal precision, the other side watched for moral symbolism. The trials became a global broadcast where millions formed conclusions in real time based on fragments, tone, body language, and edited clips. Things that aren't evidence in a courtroom, but are powerful in the court of public opinion. And once culture assigns meaning, it spreads faster than any ruling. So the courtroom era didn't just produce verdicts. It produced narratives, 2 competing stories about power, credibility, and truth in the modern age. And what happened next wasn't decided only by judges or juries, but by industries, algorithms, and audiences. Here's the part most people misunderstand. Hollywood doesn't make decisions like a jury, and it doesn't react like a fan base. It reacts like a risk department. Studios don't wake up asking who's right. They wake up asking what can break this project. And when your name becomes controversial, you don't just bring opinions, you bring volatility. Meetings get tense, lawyers get louder, insurance companies ask more questions, investors start imagining the worst-case scenario. And the moment that happens, the math changes. Brand safety is not a moral judgment, it's a business survival instinct. A studio is selling certainty to advertisers, to partners, to international distributors, to shareholders. If a star's public image becomes a lightning rod, the profit curve becomes unpredictable. The film might still succeed, but the risk becomes harder to price. And what corporations hate most isn't a bad outcome. It's an outcome they can't forecast. Public controversy = unpredictable profit curve. That's why you'll see the same pattern again and again: quiet distance, strategic silence, scheduling conflicts, projects that move in a different direction. It's rarely dramatic. It's procedural. The machine doesn't need a scandal to prove anything. It only needs enough smoke to justify lowering exposure. A studio doesn't cancel you. It de-risks you. That means replacing you before a boycott can form, avoiding you before headlines hijack marketing. Reducing association before one more viral clip pushes the story past a tipping point. It's not personal until it is. Because when the phone stops ringing, the result feels the same: opportunities collapse, allies vanish, and the public assumes the silence is guilt. And then you hit the most brutal stage of all, being labeled too expensive to defend. Not because your talent disappeared, but because your name now carries a cost no one wants on their balance sheet. So how do you come back when the machine has tagged you as too expensive to defend? A comeback like this doesn't happen because the world suddenly becomes kind. It happens because someone somewhere runs the numbers and decides the risk is worth it. That's the first rule of returning after a public war. You don't come back through the front door. You come back through side streets, quiet rooms, and smaller stages where the spotlight is softer and the stakes are lower. Because a comeback rarely begins in the same place you fell. When Hollywood gets nervous, the safest path isn't another giant franchise. It's overseas projects, independent films, or roles that don't require a studio to bet its entire year on one face. It's selective appearances, not everywhere, not all at once, so the story doesn't reignite with every headline. It's controlled narratives, fewer chaotic interviews, fewer unplanned moments, more intentional framing. Not spin exactly, more like stabilizing the signal so it doesn't get hijacked by the loudest voices online. A comeback isn't a hug from the world. It's a bet someone is willing to make. And the bet usually comes from places that can afford controversy. International audiences, art house circuits, legacy brands with their own gravity, or partners who believe the outrage cycle will cool. Sometimes it's not even about love, it's about calculation. If the audience still shows up, if the backlash doesn't translate into boycotts, if the headlines fade faster than the ticket sales, then the machine slowly opens the gate again. But here's the deeper strategy most people miss. The comeback isn't built on popularity. It's built on permission. He didn't rebuild fame first, he rebuilt permission. Permission from insurers to cover productions. Permission from distributors to release without panic. Permission from studios to market without becoming the story. Permission from the public to stop treating his name like a battlefield. That's why the first steps often look small even when the star is huge. They're tests, controlled experiments in whether the world will let you exist again without turning you into a spectacle. And once those tests start passing, the comeback stops being a rumor and becomes a roadmap. So what really happened? The honest answer isn't a slogan. It's a collision between a man, a myth, and a modern world that turns every private disaster into public sport. The rise was real. Johnny Depp didn't become a star by playing it safe. He had rare charisma, the kind you can't teach, and he built his career on character-first choices, outsiders, dreamers, damaged souls you couldn't forget. He wasn't just acting. He was disappearing into masks, and audiences loved him because he made weirdness feel human and pain feel poetic. The collapse was also real, but not as one clean moment. It was a slow burn that became an explosion, a volatility narrative that grew louder, a public conflict that turned personal life into global spectacle, and a media economy that profits from extremes. Add corporate risk logic on top of that, studios, insurers, investors who fear unpredictability more than scandal, and suddenly the same name that once opened doors starts closing them. Not because one headline proved everything, but because the machine couldn't forecast the cost of keeping him, and the comeback. That wasn't magic, it was strategy. It was a careful re-entry, often outside the same Hollywood corridors where the fall happened. It was selective choices, controlled exposure, and a shifting public mood that made room for complexity again, plus a market that decided the risk might finally be manageable. Because fame doesn't return when you are forgiven. It returns when you are fundable. And maybe that's the darkest lesson here. Maybe the real tragedy isn't that the world turned on him, it's that we turned it into entertainment. If you want more deep timeline-driven documentaries that cut through the noise, subscribe and join us. And comment below. Did this story change your view of Johnny Depp or your view of the internet? Next episode, another rise and fall where the truth gets buried under the spotlight.